Good evening, universe. So tonight I'm going to be talking about things that you can enjoy now that Supernatural, the TV series, is over. If you were a fan of the series, like I was, you may be kind of bummed that the series is over and you won't be getting any new episodes, looking for something to fill that craving. So I have compiled a list of things that may scratch kind of the same itch that Supernatural got at. Now, Supernatural definitely covered a pretty wide range of appeals, so I'm going to come at this from a couple of different angles. And the first angle is going to be the most obvious one, I think, an urban fantasy TV series with big emphasis on family relations. Obviously, this is the main thing that Supernatural was about. It was about demons and the relationship between the two brothers. So the first suggestion I have for you to watch if you liked Supernatural and if you haven't seen it yet would be Charmed. There are two versions of Charmed. There's the original, which began in, I want to say, mid-1990s and ran towards like early 2000s-ish, ended around then because it was about 8 seasons long, if I remember correctly. And there's the reboot, which was also produced by the CW, just like Supernatural. I definitely think both are fun, but if you're looking for something to replace Supernatural, I would definitely recommend the reboot version. It has more similar pacing, more similar writing, and the effects are a little bit more up to date. Both are a little bit on the campy side, especially when you compare them with Supernatural, but I think both are a good combination of making fun of themselves, having lots of demons and warlocks and all sorts of things like that to fight, and sibling relationships. Specifically, if you don't know what Charmed is like at all, it's about 3 sisters who find out that they're witches, powerful witches known as the Charmed Ones, whose destiny it is to protect the world from evil. Evil in this case usually being demons, warlocks, that sort of thing. Each of them has a special power that they can use to help fight off the forces of evil. In the original, there was a sister with telekinesis, one with the power to freeze time, and one with the power to see the future. In the reboot, there's still the telekinesis and the power to freeze time, but the last sister has the power of empathy, so she's able to pick up on whatever somebody's feeling if she touches them. I definitely think they're a lot of fun, and while they're not quite as urban feeling as Supernatural, they still have that same kind of overall background of kind of normal, regular city life, plus supernatural elements. Next up, if you don't mind a different form of media, my suggestions here are going to be books. In this case, urban fantasy books, to continue with that urban fantasy angle. Some of these have been made into TV series or movies, so you can definitely check those out. I personally haven't seen them, so I have no idea if they're any good, or if they are true to the books, or just if they're fun at all. However, I do know that I like the books a lot. So, the first book, or rather book series that I'm going to recommend is Shadowhunters. To me, if you like Supernatural, it is really hard for me to imagine you not liking Shadowhunters. The idea is basically that there exist in our world demons, and so in order to fight the demons and protect humanity, there are these other beings known as Shadowhunters, which are basically like humans plus. So they have mostly human abilities, but they're extra good at physical things, and their powers are increased further by magical runes that they inscribe onto their skin and that give them additional abilities depending on the rune. Once again, it has this urban backdrop, so each of the books takes place in a particular city, and there's usually a good amount of emphasis put on the city and fighting demons in the city and things like that. Shadowhunters is also a pretty long series, so if you're looking for a big time sink like Supernatural was, it's a good choice for that. However, if you find Shadowhunters intimidating because it's such a big time sink, I think personally that you could read each series individually without having read the one that comes before it, if you don't mind a couple of spoilers here and there. For example, the first series that was released in the Shadowhunters saga, overarching series, was The Mortal Instruments, and one that follows that chronologically are The Dark Artifices. I personally think that you can read The Dark Artifices without having read all 6 books of The Mortal Instruments if you don't want to. I do think it adds a little bit of enjoyment to the series if you've read all of them, but if you just want to skip right ahead to the Dark Artifices, I think you can totally do that. The books do a pretty good job of recontextualizing everything that's happened so that you know basically where you are by the time the series starts. Or they follow a different storyline enough that it doesn't really matter what happened in the previous books. So, like, in the Mortal Instruments, you had to have read all of the Mortal Instruments to get to the last book. But if you want to skip ahead to the Dark Artifices without reading the Mortal Instruments, you'll be okay. Hopefully that makes sense. Another reason why I think that fans of Supernatural would like this is because of the main male leads, specifically in the Mortal Instruments, which begins with City of Bones. The main male lead is a character named Jace. I think fans of Dean would really like Jace and therefore would really enjoy the Mortal Instruments. In the Dark Artifices, the main male lead is Julian, and there are definitely some things he has in common with Sam, so I think Sam fans would really enjoy the Dark Artifices. The next book series that I'm going to recommend is called The Dresden Files, and that's by Jim Butcher. This is an adult series, so it's a little bit more tonally in line with Supernatural. In this series, the title character, Harry Dresden, is a private investigator, but he's also openly a wizard. So he is happy to use his magic to solve crimes or to look into other magical goings on. He's allies with the police, so sometimes if there's something going on and they don't have a regular explanation for it, they know they can rely on him to maybe look into what the supernatural cause might be. And just like in Supernatural, it's got that city backdrop with tons of magical lore. There are huge amounts of magical creatures, like all sorts of varieties of werewolves, all varieties of vampires, fairies, so on and so forth, just like in Supernatural. Plus, the main character reminds me a little bit of a combination, I guess I would say, of Sam and Dean. He's pretty fun to follow, and the world building is really fun. I love a lot of what Butcher does with the mythical creatures and how they interact with the mortal realm. Admittedly, I haven't read that many of these books. I think I've only read the first 3, and there are a lot of them, but they tend to be fast reads. I just personally haven't gotten around to reading more of them. I do fully intend to, though. I think this one was also made into a TV series. I have no idea if it's any good. Alright, so maybe you enjoyed Supernatural for another reason. Maybe you liked it because it has this huge plot with lots of in-universe elements, a recurring huge cast that follows mainly just a small handful of characters. And maybe you also liked how epic it was, with these awesome moments that are super cinematic and rad, and they just make you feel so excited, and they're so cool, but they don't 100% necessarily make sense with the lore as you know it. Like, if you sit down and think about it, you're like, is this really how this works? But it was so cool that it doesn't really matter. In that case, I'm going to recommend to you Kingdom Hearts. Now, this may be surprising because Kingdom Hearts is pretty different tonally from Supernatural. However, just like Supernatural, it has a long, complicated lore. People have to do research to figure out how to fight monsters all the time. Research is perhaps a generous word for what they do in Kingdom Hearts. Mostly Mickey just runs around and tells you what you have to do. If you consider each season of Supernatural similar to one of the Kingdom Hearts games, you'll see that they line up surprisingly well. Each game is self-contained enough that it makes sense to be one cohesive thing, but it also falls into a larger storyline that is mostly kept together by the characters that it follows and the fact that it takes place in the same universe. Okay, I think Kingdom Hearts might be considered a multiverse. Both Supernatural and Kingdom Hearts take place in a multiverse. Additionally, in both Kingdom Hearts and Supernatural, there is magic, there are dramatic character moments, there are journals kept by mysterious characters that you have to look through in order to know what's going on. There are a lot of people that die and then come back to life repeatedly, and there are consistent villains that continue to be a problem throughout multiple games and or seasons. Admittedly, Sora is not quite as witty or sassy as either Sam and Dean, but I still think he's a pretty fun protagonist to follow. He's kind of a dense, silly person, but I legitimately think Kingdom Hearts is enjoyable, especially if you're a fan of over-the-top, awesome, dramatic things happening, even if they're not 1000% in line with what makes sense with the story. The last angle I see for what you might have enjoyed about Supernatural and what you can enjoy about some other things is maybe you just really liked the main characters being moody, hot guys with tragic pasts and complicated backstories. If that's the case, I have 2 recommendations for you. Continuing on the video game trend, I'm going to recommend Final Fantasy VII Remake. And also, by extension, Final Fantasy VII. I think both games are fantastic. Final Fantasy VII Remake is obviously going to be much prettier as it was made recently. I also think the character work and storyline is a lot smoother and better so far, but I definitely think that playing Final Fantasy VII, the original first, gives you some cool perspective. In any case, both the original and the remake follow a moody hot guy named Cloud Strife, who... I don't want to say anything that might end up being any kind of a spoiler at all, so I'm just going to say he's a moody hot guy and he has a very large sword. FF7 Remake has the added bonus of everybody else in the party also being really attractive. So you've got Cloud, we already talked about him, as well as Tifa, Aerith, and Barret, who are all gorgeous in their own ways and are fun and interesting characters to follow. The storyline is really interesting, and I definitely think that it would appeal to fans of Supernatural. Still working within the moody hot guy category, my final suggestion is going to be another book series. In this case, the book series is Daughter of Smoke and Bone by Laini Taylor. This is a trilogy and it has really beautiful writing, but more importantly, if you've been waiting for this category, the main male lead is a guy named Akiva who has a tragic martial backstory, and he's definitely very moody about it. And also the main female character, Karou, is awesome. She is also pretty badass, and the story goes into some directions that, again, I really don't want to spoil anything, and Laini Taylor novels tend to be pretty spoiler heavy if you start explaining too much, but suffice to say, I think fans of Supernatural and all the places that the Supernatural story goes would end up enjoying it. In particular, and it's not a spoiler to say this because it happens pretty quickly, there are angel characters who have these giant flaming wings. So if you like versions of angels that are maybe a little bit darker, kind of like the ones that we see in Supernatural, then I definitely recommend you check this out. So those are all my suggestions I have for more things to fill your life after it has been emptied of Supernatural, or new Supernatural at the very least. And if you're a fan of Supernatural and you have ideas about other things that you really loved, please let me know down below. Thank you so much for hanging out, and have a beautiful night, universe.